I'm down to give 2 lectures today, and that gives me an opportunity to talk about the Industrial Revolution, which is the subject of the second talk, in the context of global economic or world economic history. And that's what I'm going to do in the first lecture. Right, I called it the last 12,000 years, a short economic history of the world, but I'm not going to be talking about the last 200 years until the second lecture. Okay. Why did I say the last 12,000 years? If you do your math, right, that takes us back to 10,000 BC, right? Okay. Or if you want to be politically correct, BCE, right? Before the Common Era, which I always think is is rather amusing, because of course you're still using Christian dating, but you're just renumbering you're just recalling the characters, right? Okay, so anyway, before Christ, or before the Common Era, right? 10,000, and that of course takes us through to 2013. So we're 2013 AD, or if you want to be politically correct, Common Era. Okay, so now that's about 12,000 years, right? Okay, so what happened about 10,000 before the Common Era, or 12,000 years ago? It seems that's when settled agriculture began in the Middle East, right? In what is called traditionally Mesopotamia, which means the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. So the earliest settled agriculture is about 12,000 years. Before that, we had hunting and gathering societies, which are characterized by low population, a long lifespan, in fact, contrary to what you might think, a lot of leisure, and very limited property rights, because there really wasn't a resource constraint for a small population. Now, what was the population of the world at the time? I've seen estimates of 6 to 8 million. I've seen like 30 or 40 million, right? Nobody really knows. But in any event, they were pretty low population for the world as a whole, right? Okay? Because remember, by then, we've had people moving across the Bering Strait into America, into the Americas. So pretty much most parts of the world, right, are occupied by hunting, gathering societies. And they're living off the land. They're gathering berries and killing game and so on, right? And when they exhausted resources, they would move on, right? So if you've got a low population density, and large, abundant resources, you can do this. And then maybe years later, decades later, you come back and the berries have refruited and the game has replenished and you can harvest it all again. But you really don't need to have an elaborate system of property rights under that system, because there isn't really a resource constraint. And what happens if, in fact, you have a very abundant harvest? Well, what seems to have happened is they worked less, right? You work a shorter working week, as it were, hunting and gathering. It doesn't really come through in higher population. So that's characteristic of hunting and gathering societies then. Low population density, right? Long lifespan, although of course if you happen to fall down a ravine if you're trying to hunt a bear or something, then that probably is your end. There isn't going to be an ambulance to take you to hospital. There's a lot of leisure and limited property rights. Settled agriculture begins, as I said, about 12,000 years ago. And initially the earliest evidence is in the Middle East, then the Nile, right, the Nile Valley, the lower Nile Valley, India and China, always where there's lots of water, abundant water. So Yellow and Yangtze rivers in China, Indus and Ganges in India, right? The Nile in Africa, and the Middle East where there's water, right? And this is characterized by a number of things. Much higher population density, reduced lifespan because people are now concentrated together, so epidemics can spread fast, right? Okay. Less leisure, people working longer hours, more extensive property rights under a situation like that, and the rise of a whole lot of things that are familiar to us today. The rise of the state, an extractive elite which may live at a very high standard of living, but a very small number of people whose high standard of living is not the result of their productivity on the market, but the productivity of other people who they're able to take off a surplus. And the point is this: even if you've got low productivity on the part of agricultural workers at the time, if you have a lot of people, then you take a little bit from everybody and you can be quite rich, although the rest of us are all miserably poor. You also find the beginnings of markets, right? Okay, but they're markets. Maybe there's a sort of trade in commodities which can be produced in one place or and not available in another, right? So it would be sort of natural resource would be animating the trade, natural resource allocations, and also craft industries and things like that, catering for the elite. So there would be some markets to that extent, and for the administration of the state, the beginnings of literacy and writing, right, in order to administer the state. Okay. Now you're also going to get later on, nearer the present day, you have like 3,000-4,000. You have settled agriculture in the Americas as well. Right? Now. I'm keeping to the order of here, although I may deviate 1 or 2 points. And basically what I've written down here is the gist of the idea and 1 or 2 references and things. And if you have other questions, I'll be happy to talk about them later. All right. There's a lot of talk about, was there a European miracle at a much later date? And we're thinking of the fact that the Industrial Revolution comes along, right? And before that, Europe is already the center of world commerce and dominating the world. And Eric Jones, in a book in 1981 that then went through other revisions, talked about, actually had the title European Miracle in his title of his book. Right? Not European Miracle question mark, but the European Miracle, period. Right? Okay? And is that appropriate? Clearly things happened in Europe. All right. In contrast to that, Jack Goody, who's Jones is an economic historian. Jack Goody, who's an anthropologist, wrote a book called The Eurasian Miracle. Again, no question mark, The Eurasian Miracle, right? And if you read the book, if you read the introduction, it's clear that it's a response, to some extent, that the title is a play off Eric Jones's The European Miracle, right? Now, what Jack Goody argues is that actually some part of Eurasia has always been, Eurasia being Europe and Asia, right, has always been at the forefront, the cutting edge of human progress, right? Now, when you think about it, if you were on a spaceship or on the moon, you really wouldn't think of, you'd see these blobs, right? You think North America, South America, Africa, right? And you probably wouldn't want to label Europe a separate continent. I mean, it's like a peninsula of this much larger landmass, which is Asia, right? Okay? And then if you like, you've got Australia down in the corner, right? Depending on which perspective you're looking at it, right? Of course, if you're looking upside down, then it's up in a different corner. All right, so Europe is really, I mean, to say Europe is a separate continent, right, is perhaps a little bit of a conceit by the Europeans. After all, they're the ones who labelled the continents as they were, right? We start out from Europe, and then we find there's Asia, and then we find there's Africa, and the world revolves around Europe. Okay. Now, so nonetheless, it may be there was a European miracle, but Jack Goody likes to argue that the cutting edge has always been somewhere on the Eurasian continent, right? Alternatively, between China and Europe, right, for the most part. Right. Okay. Now he's not opposed. I mean, he doesn't have a bias against Africa or the New World, but he argues that no, sub-Saharan Africa, although it did have actually quite extensive settlements, agriculture, trade, and a whole lot of things, right, and also the same with the Americas, was never quite at the cutting edge, right? That the cutting edge has gone backwards and forwards between Europe and Asia. Right, more particularly between Europe and China. Yes, ma'am?
That sounds a lot like Jared Diamond's argument, right, in Guns, Germs, and Steel. Does Jack Goody attribute to geographical things like, domesticable animals and like...
Well, okay. He does. Okay. Number one, his argument isn't really turns on Jared Diamond's arguments, right? I mean, he does talk about. He obviously discusses things like domesticable animals and domestication of animals. Sorry, so, and a bunch of other things, but his argument isn't really Jared Diamond's argument.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I wasn't suggesting it's the same argument.
No. But
if he attributes Eurasia's increased development to the same geographical reasons, I mean, is he speculating about why the Eurasian Miracle took place?
I'm not so sure he does in the same way, in the way in which Jared Diamond does. Actually, as I think about it, I don't. You asked me a question I've never actually really thought of explicitly in those terms. I don't want to say. I mean, they're somewhat, I suppose, compatible arguments, but he's not. That's not the way he writes the Eurasian Miracle, actually, right? It's not. You wouldn't. He's not writing it in that way. Okay, and there's other things in I mean, in a way, Goody is about Goody is addressing the argument, right, that Europe was somehow always out in the lead, right, or from the lead from a very early time. And what he's saying is, no, it's alternation. There are European centuries, and there are also Chinese centuries. And if you put it into perspective, China has been in the lead for a longer part of human history than Europe, right? Now, of course, more recently, of course, has been Europe, right? And then he sort of speculates maybe it's shifting to China now, all right? So it's he's looking at something rather differently than Diamond is. I think that's fair to say. Okay, so is it a European miracle? Is it a Eurasian miracle? We'll come back to that. We'll talk about that. Okay, but what Goody is saying, and he's certainly not trying to disparage other societies and other civilizations, he said that it is not a question, you don't. I mean, some people do, actually. There's a fellow called Blount who does. He says, okay, Africa, and throws in the New World as well. But Goody says no. The cutting edge of human progress, right, okay, in terms of technology and so on, has always been somewhere in Europe, right? Okay, so that's why he calls it Eurasian Miracle. It's not that he's really keen on the phrase miracle, you understand, but it's a response to Jones's argument, European miracle. And Jones, by the way, has a lot of good stuff in him. I'm not disparaging Jones, right? But the question is actually how special is Europe in contrast to, say, the rest of Asia? All right, we'll talk about that. And the whole morning, on both talks, you'll see the answer, and it's quite a sophisticated answer. Okay, so let's go back to Europe then, all right, because that is, after all, where the Industrial Revolution began. It began in Britain, right, certain parts of Britain in the late 18th century. And so let's look to see Europe. Well, you might think of the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire, and this probably isn't telling you anything you don't already know, was centered on the Mediterranean Sea. There really wasn't a European economy under the Romans. The Romans, it's true, traded with distant parts, right, but there wasn't a true European economy until about 1000 of the Common Era, right, about 1000 years ago, right. The Roman Empire was centered on the Mediterranean. They, as you may know, they occupied England, and they went as far as Hadrian's Wall, which is the border between England and Scotland. And you can, even today, you can walk along Hadrian's Wall, right? Okay. And England, particularly Cornwall, was noted for tin. It was one of the very few places where you could get tin. So there was been a trade for thousands of years between Cornwall and other parts of Europe for tin, because you need tin for making bronze. And the Romans went up to the Danube, right? Okay, they occupied France, they occupied Spain, of course, Italy, France, chunk of Germany, present-day Germany, right up to the Danube and the southern Balkans, and then, of course, into the Middle East, right, or the Near East, rather old-fashioned term. And, of course, the whole coastline, the littoral of North Africa. right, including, of course, the Nile Delta, right. But they didn't go very far into Africa because, of course, you then run into the Sahara Desert. I mean, why would you? Why would you want to conquer the Sahara Desert, right? Okay. Now, the Roman Empire, there's a recent book, actually I came across this, in fact, a friend referred me to this book, and I wasn't even aware of it the last time I gave this talk on Monday of last week, right, okay? It didn't surprise me, the thesis, but I wasn't aware of it. And this is a book edited by Temin, Peter Temin, who's a retired economic historian from MIT, who's done a lot of stuff, actually. Anyway, and he originally rose to prominence because he argued against Milton Friedman's theory on the Great Depression, in fact. And I'm not here to endorse all of Temin, but Temin's written a book based on some other articles he did on the Roman market economy. And his argument is that contrary to, and I use this word very carefully, I'm not using this as a disparagement, and that is Marxist scholars, because they are avowedly Marxist scholars who argued that, particularly Finlay, who's dead now, but a leading classicist who was Marxist as well, in fact. Finlay, F-I-N-L-Y, and, right, anyway, he had a position at the University of Cambridge in England for many years. Anyway, Finlay argued, following on from Karl Polanyi, okay, all right, Karl, K-A-R-L, as in Karl Marx, Polanyi. Now, by the way, if you ever come across, have they in the course of this week heard the name Michael Polanyi? No particular reason why you would have done, except Michael Polanyi is actually very, in many ways, very individualist and so on. He was a chemist originally, right? And then Michael Polanyi did stuff on the pretense of knowledge. It's very Hayekian, actually. All right. So anyway, Michael Polanyi, he had a brother called Karl, I think it's his brother. Was a cousin, forget. Anyway, Karl Polanyi, and Karl Polanyi couldn't be any more different than in one direction than Michael was in the other. Anyway, Karl Polanyi was I think it was University of Chicago, quite famous historian, but basically playing down the role of markets and boosting the role of the state in the reasons for economic progress. All right, I'm not here to give you a lecture on Karl Polanyi, and I'm not equipped to give you a lecture on Karl Polanyi, and I'm not defending Karl Polanyi, right? But Polanyi's view was that markets were rudimentary and it was really all the economic progress was due to the state. Finlay picks up on this, and whatever his credentials as a classical scholar, and I'm not doubting it actually, he argues that the Roman Empire had very little in the way of markets, right? It was all to do with government, right? Okay, and Temin, Peter Temin, right, okay, I'll put his name up here for you, Peter Temin, he argues actually it was much more extensive markets in the Roman Empire than you might think, okay, and and apparently the classical scholars who study economics are shifting their opinions now more towards a Temin approach. Temin has, over the years, gradually persuaded people that in fact the Roman economy was much more of a market-based economy and not central direction in the way in which was just assumed to be by Finlay and Polanyi, right? Okay. So the Roman Empire, it seems, was pretty much a market economy in many ways. Having with that caveat, and you think a lot about Roman buildings and architecture, okay, and yes, they did have some, construction of aqueducts and a whole lot of things like that, but they came nowhere near to the construction techniques of the Middle Ages, as you'll see, right? Okay. So they were very good at military. Well, after all, the Roman Empire, the Romans did conquer a large chunk of the known world, right? So they're big on military technology, all right? But in terms of other technology, it wasn't that advanced, actually, right? Okay, it wasn't that advanced. They may have left us a great legacy of learning and, law and so on, but technologically they weren't that advanced, right, in the way in which actually the Middle Ages were more advanced. Okay. Okay, so the Roman Empire collapses gradually over a period of hundreds of years, right, for various reasons, which I don't really want to get into because it gets quite technical and there's various reasons. We can talk about it. Nothing's ruled out for the question time. But I want to press on into what English-speaking scholars in Britain and America call the Dark Ages. Now, it's interesting that German scholars and French scholars of the period do not call it the Dark Ages, or the equivalent in French and German. They don't call it the Dark Ages. Dark Ages is a term that's used. You may have heard of it, right? The period after the collapse of Rome. But it's actually a term used by English-speaking scholars, right? Because, and this reflects something that European scholars don't think of it as dark as perhaps the name implies, right? Okay, so that's why I put Dark Ages in inverted commas, right? Dark Ages in inverted commas. Now, there was a collapse of Roman rule. As the barbarians, right, that's the Roman name for them, right, swept in, and of course included the Goths and the Vandals, hence of course the modern usages of the words Goth and Vandal, right? Okay, all right, that's where it comes from. That's where it comes from. They were tribes that ruled the Roman Empire, but the Roman roads fell into disrepair, and the water was no longer carried by the aqueducts, and they didn't have clean baths and things like that. And my ancestors, my barbarian ancestors, were all very grubby, and your barbarian ancestors, who came from Europe, were all very grubby people who very rarely bathed, right? Very smelly, grubby people, right? But I will take your question in just one moment. Yeah. All right, yeah, go on.
It's a myth, actually, that filthiness of people in the early Middle Ages has been greatly exaggerated. There were actually public baths in a lot of medieval towns. It was the Black Death and the idea that bathing was medically dangerous that developed afterwards. That
yes, I don't want to gainsay that, but for barbarians, right, pouring into the Roman Empire, I don't think they were taking the baths that Romans did, right? Okay. I mean, it may well be that dirt is exaggerated. In fact, I think that's probably quite true. In fact, I think one reason why I'm not allergic to a lot of things people ask is because I grew up in a dirtier era, right? Seriously, actually, we weren't sanitized the way you guys were, playing out there in the gutter. Well, not quite, but I do actually think the sort of sanitized existence young people now have makes them actually more susceptible to these things. I mean, on the other hand, though, the Romans, or at least some of the Romans, right, they did actually have far more baths, right? But my point isn't to say how uncivilized the barbarians were. In fact, I was going on to say, right, that the barbarians, so-called, right, I mean, it's a bad name. I mean, that's what the Romans call them, right, barbarian. And of course, we have a modern connotation. If somebody's a barbarian, they're really pretty rough, right? Okay, but that's where it comes from. Just like Vandal and Goth, right? In their different ways. Now, okay, so yes, various infrastructure fell apart, okay, but it wasn't the end of law. After all, the English common law, which is in fact applies in every 49 of the 50 states of the Union. Quick trivia question: in which state does it not apply? Louisiana, correct, right? Which is French civil law. So English common law comes out of the Anglo-Saxons, right? It comes out of the Germanic tribes, right? So it isn't like they didn't have law, right? Okay, and they did have markets, right? But the population, it has to be said, the population did decline, right? Quite substantially, right? Quite substantially for whatever reasons, okay? And there was not as much of a network of markets and trading to support that. We know that. But it did recover, and there was one technological aspect in which the barbarians were more advanced than the Romans, and that was the working of iron, right? Iron technology in iron, right? Metalworking, right? In iron. The German tribes are more advanced than the Romans, okay? So all I'm doing is I'm trying to put it into context, right? It isn't like the magnificent Roman Roman civilization, and then it all collapses, and then we have these barbarians for 500 years, and then finally we emerge into the modern era, right? It's a much more complicated story than that, a much more complex, a much more interesting story than that. Okay, right, so there is population decline and expansion, there is a recovery, right? There is technological regress, okay, but not in ironworking, okay? And by 1000, right, we have the emergence of a European economy. Right? We have emergence of a European economy, European-wide economy, a lot of trading network, right? And then depends where you want to date the Middle Ages. Do you want to date the Middle Ages from the fall of Rome, right, and for the sacking of Rome, right, by the Vandals, or whatever? Now, you've got to remember the Roman Empire, as some of you probably know, maybe better than I do, the Roman Empire split into two halves, right? Okay, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. And the Western Roman Empire collapses, right, okay, with the fall of Rome. The Eastern Roman Empire carries on until 1453, ever diminishing territories, right, when finally, what happens in 1453, but Constantinople is taken by the Turks, right, by the Ottoman Turks, right? That is the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. That makes the Roman Empire actually, if you define it in terms of the foundation of Rome, right, okay, foundation of Rome, way back in the mists of time, right, all the way through, then the Roman Empire, right, which of course is post, 1 AD or 1 BC, right, okay, and then right up through the fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, right up, it's the longest lasting empire the world's ever seen, right, in some sense, right, okay, right up to, and that's the Byzantium, and the Byzantine Empire, right. And it has it controls quite a lot of the Eastern Mediterranean. Then it shrinks, right, and expands again, and shrinks, right. But basically, it overwhelmed finally by the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks have already conquered much of the Balkans and then come in and take Constantinople. All right. Okay. Right. So in Western Europe, of course, we have Latin Christianity. Right. Okay. What eventually becomes what we call the Catholic Church. And the Middle Ages is not a period of stagnation, and no scholar now would claim that it was, right? Okay. There is an extensive growth of markets and the division of labour. Feudalism disappears from England by about 1200, right? Okay. So, admittedly, this is the first country from which feudalism disappears. Right. I mean, feudalism carries on, of course, in East Central Europe until the in the middle late 18th century, and in Russia until 1861, right? 1861, and the emancipation of the serfs. But in Britain, we have an active labour market, right? Because serfs are attached to the land, so when land transfers, you transfer the serfs. It's not the same thing as slavery, although I think I'd rather be, if I had the choice, I'd rather be an educated slave who was teaching the children of the master in a Roman home, right, and treated very well, rather than a serf, right, on some desolate community in East Central Europe, right? I think I'd rather be a Roman slave than, or an educated Roman slave. I wouldn't want to be building the pyramids or something, or something like that, or building the aqueducts. But I think I'd rather be an educated slave than a serf. But a serf is actually, strictly speaking, is attached to the master, owes, product, has to work the master's land, but does have time to grow his own crops and things, right? So it's not quite the same thing as slavery, right? But it's another form of forced labour, yes?
Sorry, I don't know why I'm interrupting so much, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
This is, never mind, maybe it's a digression. Didn't serfdom in Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe gradually, in the 17th and 18th centuries, become more akin to chattel slavery than it was earlier?
In some ways, it worsened. In some examples of serfdom, it does. You're quite right. You're quite right. But I wouldn't want to call serfdom in Russia in 1861, prior to the emancipation, chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is really a New World phenomenon, right? Okay. And of course, in the New World, it was racialized in a way in which it was never elsewhere in the Roman Empire, right? It was racialized in Arab countries, right? And in fact, actually, I'm not an authority on slavery under the Arabs, right? Okay, and I've read very little. I've read as much as you can read in 10. I mean, you know, you can read up to my level of knowledge in 10 minutes. It's all intriguing subject, not one I've really investigated. But some of the estimates for people of African descent, black Africans, right? Okay, who are sold into who are sold or made into slaves under the Arabs over a much longer period than the West did in the New World, right? So understand that it's over a longer period. The numbers, some of the estimates come as high as the numbers that were transported to the New World, right? And in some ways, right, they were actually treated worse, right? Okay. In some ways they were treated worse in some cases. There was a lot, for example, of castration and so on. All right, okay. But of course slavery takes many different forms and so on. All right. Anyway, come back to that. Always happy to take questions after. All right, so so Britain, okay, this is my starting point, was Britain, right, okay, or England, more precisely, so I'm going to be very careful here. England and not Britain. Britain, after all, is the main island and it comprises Scotland and Wales. Wales is conquered by the English by 1300, and Scotland doesn't formally become part of, with England, Britain until 1707. That's the Union of Crowns. There was a Union of the Crowns in the 16th century, in the 17th century, which means the same monarch ruled both countries, Union of Crowns. Right? But the parliaments, the Scottish Parliament wasn't dissolved until prior to 1707. And at that point, Britain emerged. Okay, that's quite important for later on, as you'll see. All right, so we have so in England we have the abolition of serfdom, right, okay, by about 1200. We have an active labour market, which is part of my point about markets flourishing, right? We have extensive division of labour, right? Of course, most people are still engaged in subsistence on the land, right? But there is a growth of money, markets, right? Money in order to facilitate transactions and exchange. Banking, northern Italy, right? Very early on. Urbanisation, people living in cities and towns, right? Now, think about it like this. If you're living and working in a city or a town, right, you're not growing food. So one measure of agricultural productivity, they're very ingenious, that economic historians use is, you see, if you've got, say, 20% of the population living in towns, which actually England has, it has a faster rate of urbanisation, same with northern Italy, has a higher rate of urbanisation by the late Middle Ages than most parts of Europe, right? If you say, let's say it's 20%, for the sake of argument. In fact, the evidence is it was as high as 20% in England, right, by about 1400. Number one, of course, this means disease spreads faster, and we'll come back to the Black Death, right? But it also means, of course, that if people are living in cities, they're not growing crops. So therefore, they have to be fed, right? So this is used by historians as a proxy for agricultural productivity, right? We can't, after all, how to get a grip on the productivity of agriculture, right? And increasing productivity of agriculture. How do we get a grip on that? Well, very difficult. But if we say 20% rather than 10% of people living in cities, then it does suggest, right, that the 80 rather than 90% of the population can feed the 100%. You with me? So it does suggest rising agricultural productivity. And there are a number of innovations that came in. For example, horses rather than oxen in northwestern Europe. The idea of allowing fields to lie fallow for 1 in 3 years, right? Okay, and a variety of other things, but these are all very slow changes. But they must raise agricultural productivity in the long run. Now, it's not particularly anything you're going to notice compared with your parents, right, okay? But in the long run, it is raising agricultural productivity because urbanisation, the number of people in cities is growing, right, throughout Europe and particularly in places like England and Italy. That makes them vulnerable, yes, it makes them vulnerable to the Black Death, to plague and disease. Okay, so, and there is technological progress. Technological progress The cutting edge of technological progress until about 1200 was the Muslim Arabs, right? And when I say that, I mean in terms of irrigation, right? In Spain, for example, they conquered Spain. And a scientific and technological progress, astronomy and writing, literacy, a whole lot of things, right? Okay, not just technological progress in a narrow sense. Some of those innovations that the Muslims brought to Europe came from China, right? Across the Indian Ocean, right? And you do find at this time when inland transport is very slow and very poor, right? I mean, not very functional. That the main ways in which ideas and goods and people get around is the seas, right? Okay, that really does make a lot of difference. If you've got a good water route, whether it's a navigable canal, as you'll see later on, or if it's the Atlantic Ocean, right, it does permit much easier passage than even going 100 miles inland to the coast, right? Okay, you can travel 1,000 miles on a ship much more easily than 50 miles to the coast. After about 1200, the Europeans do sort of start getting the edge on technological progress. Building, I mean, the churches of the Middle Ages far surpass anything the Romans ever constructed, right? And that we can see them today. Right? You can admire them today. Mechanical clocks, that's a European invention. Not clocks, right? Not water clocks, not sundials, but mechanical clocks. Right? And not printing, that's Chinese, but printing using movable type, right? Gutenberg printing press. Okay? That is a European invention. Yes?
When you talk about, like, far surpass what the Romans built, are you talking about, like, you mean sheer amazingness or, like, mechanical ingenuity? Like, some of the baths were pretty intricate in their designs.
Yeah, I was talking specifically about construction, bricks and mortar, and actually, number one, they are amazing, you know, your first sense, right? And the techniques they have to use to do it is also amazing, right? It's not just wow, right, you know, the soaring spires of Gothic cathedrals, but it's also actually the techniques used to build a Gothic cathedral, right? Okay, so it's both, actually it's wow on both ways, I would say, as I think about it. Okay? All right. Now, so by 1500, right, okay, so Constantinople has fallen to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, and the New World has been discovered in 1492, right? So by the 15th century, it's 1400s, right? Okay, certainly by 1500, Europe is technologically advanced, more advanced than elsewhere, right? Okay, but you must recognise there is, you know, there's more communication between the different parts of Eurasia than you might might assume without much thought. Now, I want to now talk about different sorts of economic growth. All right, okay. Economic growth, I've discussed them here. I say extensive or intensive. Extensive economic growth is not very interesting, right? In the sense that there's no rise in output per person. If the population doubles and we're doing the same thing, right, then presumably output is going to, I wouldn't necessarily say double, because you might hit diminishing returns, right? You might be harvesting from less fertile areas and less fertile fields, right? But output presumably is going to go up if you have twice as many people, right? But that's not terribly interesting. It's not usually what economists mean by economic growth. By economic growth, what they usually mean, although I always believe in making things explicit rather than implicit, is a rise in output per person, right? Okay? And that is always accompanied by economic development of some sort. And when I say economic development, I mean increasingly intricate economic organisation. The use of markets, trade, division of labour, and so on. And there's a famous quote by Adam Smith on the division of labour is limited by the size of the market. The more extensive the market, the more scope there is for division of labour. Right? It's a very famous quote by Smith. And that's true in the Middle Ages and true in the Roman Empire. Right? Okay. So, mention the Black Death. If you ever found yourself in a time machine and it's 1347 and you're transported to Europe, get as fast as you can to Iceland, because Iceland was one of the very few places that was spared the Black Death. So my advice to you is if you're ever in 1347, 1346 and the bubonic plague is about to begin, then take a trip to Iceland. Take a boat to Iceland, right? You'll be spared. Now, the Black Death, okay, it did have a devastating impact, particularly on Western Europe, and thinking about serfdom, it has less of an impact on Eastern Europe, because, in other words, it had less of an impact on the population of Eastern Europe, because Eastern Europe was more sparsely populated, and the disease didn't spread as fast, right, or as much. Okay. But it did devastate pretty much the whole of Europe, except for Iceland. And it did devastate North Africa, right, settlements along North Africa, and into the Middle East, and it reached India, actually. What was the Black Death? Almost certainly, it is accepted now, there's a debate about this, but I think it's generally accepted now as bubonic plague, which was carried by fleas on the back of rats, right? And it arrived with a sort of a caravan across the, a caravan arriving in the Black Sea, right? A caravan coming from Asia at the Black Sea. And it got, because the rats run on board the ships, and the ships start going out, and before you know where you are, you have a devastating plague within the next few years. And in some parts of Italy, urbanized northern Italy, the death rate was as high as 50%. But every cloud has a silver lining, right? If you survive the Black Death for the rest of your life, you can look forward to much higher real wages, meaning much higher purchasing power of wages if you're a labourer. And the reason is, of course, that, and you have a better diet as well, actually. And I'll tell you why. Because, number one, of course, you're no longer cultivating the least good land, right, because there's fewer of you. So your productivity rises as a result. It also means you don't need to cultivate the less good land for grain. You can have cows for pasture, and that means milk and meat, right? So the diet improved, actually. Now, eventually the population recovers, right? By the 16th century, different estimates put it like 1500, 1550, right? We've gotten back to what it was before the plague in 1347. But it takes a long time to get back, right? At least 150 years, maybe more. Okay. There's a famous quote by Smith in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, but Smith is actually not the first one to have this almost identical quote. It's by the more radical French writer Guillaume Thomas François Renaud in 1770. Now, he said that the two most significant events in world history, at least world history for Europeans, right, is the discovery of an all-water route to the Orient, and that was by the Portuguese explorers, all the way round the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, and then in through the Indian Ocean. And the discovery of the New World by Columbus. Now, I realize that Columbus didn't discover the New World, right? It was discovered thousands and thousands of years before by people who came in over the Bering Strait. And I realize that there's no doubt that the Vikings did settle in, part of what is now Canada, okay, and Greenland. That, by the way, Greenland, the reason why Greenland's called Greenland is because in the early Middle Ages, the climate was warmer and a lot of vegetation flourished in southern Greenland. That's why it's called Greenland. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it Greenland. I suppose we might go back to calling it Greenland. Anyway, but that's the reason, right? Okay. Now, what happened was the climate did get colder, right? Okay. All right. The climate got colder, and it drove out. Either the people died, or quite possibly they just left. Right? It was too cold. So European settlements in like Greenland and the upper northeast corner of North America, they ceased. Right? Okay. And then it's left for Columbus. And Columbus, remember, you probably know this, was looking, of course, for a passage to the East Indies, the Spice Islands, which, of course, the Portuguese, right, had already found the way round the Cape of Good Hope, right? And the Moluccas, which is the Spice Islands, became Portuguese territory until it was seized by the Dutch later on. Right? Okay. And I think that's fair. I think actually the two most important events in in world history in, say, 1500, right, or 1550, right, can reasonably be said to be the discovery of an all-water route to the Orient and the discovery of the New World. Now, I used to set a multiple choice question, right, for my economic historians, and I used to throw in a few other things, including Marco Polo, right? But Marco Polo doesn't count. I mean, it's an interesting travel log, but that's not terribly significant in world history. What is significant is the Portuguese around the Cape of Good Hope and the Spanish and Portuguese to the New World. Okay, so, all right. So Europe comes, and Europe, by the way, has firearms, and this does contribute towards subduing the local populations. So really, for a few centuries, Europe is right at the heart of human progress. Progress defined in a broad sense, meaning, right, population expansion, commercial expansion, more sophistication, more civilization in some way, right? Okay. And domination of the world, right? Domination of the world, okay. So we have the Spanish and Portuguese in the New World, followed by, of course, in the North America by the French and the British, right? The Dutch, don't forget the Dutch. After all, Manhattan is a Dutch name, right? The Dutch also settled in Brazil as well, seized from Portugal, right? The Dutch, and what you had was the rise of the Dutch, right? And they're very interesting. Not so much for our purposes the rise of the Dutch commercial empire, which was eventually lost out to the British commercial empire in the 18th century, late 17th, 18th century, but rather the Dutch economy and society at home. Now, there's a guy called Jan de Vries, who is both a professor of history and a professor of economics at UC Berkeley. And he has written on the Dutch economy extensively, and more recently he's written a book called The Industrious Revolution. That's the title, 2008. Okay? He gets the name from, I've given you the name, Akira Hayami, who's a Japanese scholar who uses the term industrious revolution to apply to the rising agricultural productivity in Japan, right? Okay, so it's a totally different context. And De Vries gives him credit for the name. But he borrows this term, right, which is fine, and uses it to describe the Netherlands. Now, we might loosely call the Netherlands, I do, right, Holland, right? But Holland is actually only one province of the Netherlands. And in those days, it was the Dutch Republic. They'd won independence from Spain, from the Spanish Netherlands, which remained, what is present-day Belgium, remained in Spanish hands, right, okay? And the Dutch Republic flourished, not least because it was extremely hospitable towards dissenters, right? Protestant dissenters in a Catholic Europe, Jews, right, particularly Jews, right? It was a very hospitable climate. And those people brought their smarts, right, okay, and brought their sense of commerce. So although, yes, the Dutch Republic was the heart of the Dutch Empire, right, well, equally, you could say Madrid was the heart of the Spanish Empire, right? And by the 17th century, the early 17th century, the Spanish Empire was already in decline, right? So it didn't help just to have a lot of possessions in the New World, right? Okay, it didn't help. And there's some very interesting sort of comparative studies on the decline of the Spanish and Portuguese and the rise of the Dutch, right? What makes it different. So just having large quantities of land and possessions of gold, right, and silver being shipped in from your possessions doesn't actually enhance your long-run ability in the world to survive. Where did, actually interestingly enough, a bit of a trivial question, but where did most of the silver from the New World end up? It ended up in China, right? It didn't end up in Europe. I mean, it might have come to Europe somewhat, but every year there were galleons passing across from the New World across the Pacific to China every year. There were galleons shipping silver to China, right? And the Spanish, of course, were able to buy a lot of manufactures, right, and food, right, and commodities with their gold and silver. But in terms of the long-term economic development of Spain, no, right? Spain is actually one of the last countries to industrialize in Europe. Starts industrializing around Catalonia in 1890. That's a story I'll tell you about later. But Spain is very backward, right? And so is Portugal, okay, despite having these vast empires. Right? So that might cause us to be skeptical of the question of the role of empires in the rise of the European industrialization, you see. Because Britain does have an empire, a very extensive empire, right? Okay? And some people like to say, well, the wealth from the empire financed the Industrial Revolution. And I really don't think that is really much of an explanation at all. Right? Okay? And this doesn't disprove it, but it does cause us to question it when we see some very wealthy empires that fall into desertitude, like the Spanish and Portuguese empires. All right, so Jan de Vries, okay, Jan de Vries talks about the first modern society in the world is the Dutch Republic, okay? And it's characterized, as I said, if you look at the notes, as a revolution of expectations, a demand for goods over leisure. And they contrast the old luxury versus the new luxury. The old luxury, right, the old luxury is the luxury of the ruling class of an extractive elite, right, with very large numbers of serfs, slaves, or whatever, working their backs off, right, at low productivity levels, but if you take a little bit from very large numbers of people, you can be very wealthy. That's the old luxury. The new luxury is the product of ordinary people making their way in the world, in a commercial world. And there is a consumer revolution. The highest agricultural productivity in the world, right? Now, what do we mean by agricultural productivity? You can measure it in different ways. Here we're talking about per acre. In other words, the application of ingenuity and manures and fertilizers and new seed varieties increases the yield per acre in the 17th century Netherlands. Now, in England, they actually overtake agricultural productivity in the Netherlands by the 18th century. But that's a story for the next lecture. Okay. There is a growth of commerce, accountancy, law, medicine, and the middle classes. And this is what we might call Smithian growth. Named after Adam Smith, not that he went around calling it Smithian growth, but it's the sort of commercial society that Smith describes so eloquently in The Wealth of Nations. I've now brought you up to the eve of the Industrial Revolution, and I see the time is approaching 10 o'clock.